When the private call leaked, Buckingham Palace went into immediate lockdown. What was said wasn't just personal, it was explosive. For the first time, the world heard King Charles's voice trembling with rage and heartbreak. "I can't trust her anymore," he confessed. But who was he talking about? And why now? What had happened behind palace doors to push a monarch this far? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The leak hit the airwaves like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through Britain and beyond. Major outlets scrambled to verify the authenticity of the recording, while social media erupted with a storm of speculation, theories, and breakdowns of every syllable uttered in that emotionally charged moment. Experts on royal affairs were called in, speech analysts dissected Charles's tone, and lip readers began speculating on what else may have been said before or after that moment. It wasn't just the words, it was the raw, unmistakable pain behind them. For a monarch so carefully trained in restraint, hearing Charles openly break down wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. The palace, caught entirely off guard, issued an initial denial. "The king has not participated in any calls of the sort," the official statement read. But within hours, that line of defense crumbled under the weight of insider confirmations. A senior source, still unnamed, confirmed that the voice was authentic, the call real, and the emotions genuine. And that only deepened the mystery. Who had leaked such a private conversation? And why? The walls of the monarchy, already riddled with cracks from past controversies, now threatened to collapse entirely under the weight of this new scandal. Speculation quickly mounted. Who was her? The obvious assumption was Queen Camilla, the woman Charles once risked his crown to love openly. But others weren't so sure. Whispers pointed to another royal woman, someone closer to Charles in recent months. Some dared to suggest it could be Catherine. Others feared an even darker truth that the her in question wasn't a royal at all, but someone buried deeper in the king's personal affairs. The ambiguity only fueled the chaos. Each new theory, each supposed clue, added another layer to the emotional minefield Buckingham Palace was now trapped in. Behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. Anonymous staffers began speaking to select reporters, revealing that tensions within the palace had been boiling for months. Charles's trust, once hard-earned and rarely given, had begun to erode, not just with his wife, but with key advisors and aides. One particular aide, recently demoted and described as deeply embittered, became the center of growing suspicion. Could this be the one who leaked the tape? Was this an act of revenge or something far more coordinated? The public reaction was swift and unforgiving. In a nation used to the stiff upper lip of royalty, hearing their king falter so openly shook the very foundations of tradition. Some sympathized, seeing in Charles a man stretched too far. Others demanded accountability, insisting this breach of control signaled a broader collapse within the monarchy itself. And all the while, silence loomed from within the palace walls, thick and telling. But to understand why this call mattered so deeply, we must rewind to the moments that led up to it, an unraveling months in the making. Behind every royal smile is a secret, and behind every royal vow, a compromise. Charles and Camilla presented unity, but the palace walls heard the arguments, the icy silences, the growing distance. What the public didn't see was a man questioning the loyalty of the one he fought the world to marry. Their story was supposed to be the great reconciliation, the scandalous love affair that had finally earned its place in the spotlight. But behind the public narrative of redemption and romance, something much darker had begun to unfold. Rumors of tension, long dismissed as tabloid fiction, began to take on a chilling weight. Staff members spoke in hushed tones about the flickers of frustration they witnessed during private functions. The small things began to speak volumes. Charles choosing separate cars, Camilla declining to attend events at the last moment. Their once synchronized appearances now marked by awkward spacing and frosty silence. At state dinners and high-profile engagements, seating charts were reportedly altered last minute due to unexpected discomfort. What once looked like coordination now felt like distance masked as formality. Camilla's role in state affairs had begun to shift, not just in visibility, but in weight. While once she was seen as a supportive consort, now she was said to be overstepping, engaging in discussions and attending functions without clearance from Charles's office. Allegedly, there were meetings with foreign dignitaries that Charles was only made aware of after the fact, meetings Camilla claimed were arranged through mutual charitable causes, but which Charles viewed as political maneuvering. Her confidence, once a source of pride for him, had started to feel like a threat. He was the monarch, but it seemed she was writing her own rules, and worse, writing him out of his own script. That friction intensified as Charles's inner circle began raising alarms about Camilla's growing network. New advisors, fresh PR hires, communications officers with loyalties that didn't necessarily align with Buckingham Palace's official direction. It all fed into a slow-burning paranoia that Charles couldn't ignore. According to insiders, he became increasingly withdrawn, reviewing schedules personally, requesting updates on who Camilla was meeting, and perhaps most tellingly demanding that certain calls be logged and monitored. What had once been a love story of triumph over adversity had warped into a political chessboard, with trust eroding one whisper at a time. Then came the reports of Charles's resentment private complaints about Camilla's unauthorized initiatives, appearances she approved without informing him, comments made to press contacts he no longer trusted. He was blindsided too often, made to look reactive rather than commanding. That feeling, the sense that he was no longer in control of his own image, his own court, or even his own marriage, cut deep. His pride was wounded, but so was his faith in the very person he had once fought tradition to protect. What broke him, sources say, wasn't a grand betrayal but 1,000 quiet ones. Charles reportedly confided to a trusted family aide that he no longer felt supported, only managed. That phrase, haunting and subtle, revealed more than any headline could. He wasn't being cherished, he was being handled. And in the mind of a monarch who had spent a lifetime fighting for legitimacy, that realization stung with a special cruelty. As tension rose in his marriage, another woman quietly stepped into the emotional vacuum, and Charles's divided heart became a palace battleground. She wasn't supposed to be a threat. She was the loyal daughter-in-law, the devoted wife, the steady mother. But behind the scenes, Catherine became something more: a listener, a strategist, a source of comfort. And to Camilla's horror, Charles began to lean on her more than ever before. In the vacuum left by eroding trust, Charles gravitated toward familiarity, toward calm, and Catherine embodied both. She had always played her role with precision, never stepping beyond the boundaries expected of her, never drawing attention to herself for the wrong reasons. But as the king found himself questioning his own inner circle, it was Catherine's silence that spoke the loudest. In her, he saw not ambition, but stability. She didn't ask for power. She earned his confidence simply by being present when others fell away. And it started quietly. A private meeting here, a casual check-in there. Then came the briefings meetings originally meant for senior advisors, but now featuring Catherine's insights, her polished counsel, her perceptive understanding of how the public truly saw the crown. Those inside the palace began to notice the shift. What once were formal interactions between monarch and daughter-in-law had transformed into long, closed-door conversations. It wasn't just duty anymore. Charles was confiding in her his disappointments, his regrets, his fears about the direction Camilla was pulling the monarchy. The line between political advisor and emotional confidant blurred, and whispers began circling like vultures. Palace aides, particularly those loyal to Camilla, grew uneasy. One insider described the dynamic as emotionally charged but unspoken. Others labeled it dangerous. They said Charles smiled more after these meetings, but with a distant look, like he was planning something no one had quite grasped yet. Even more unsettling was William's silence. He didn't interfere. He didn't object. He watched. And that lack of resistance only emboldened Charles further. Perhaps William saw it as a family bond strengthening. Or perhaps he, too, recognized that Catherine was quietly becoming the true compass of the royal family. Her ability to navigate the storm without making waves was a skill neither Charles nor Camilla could afford to underestimate, but Camilla did. And when she finally realized the gravity of what was unfolding, it was too late to contain it. According to multiple sources, she confronted Charles behind closed doors, demanding a redefinition of Catherine's role, asking that she be repositioned to a more traditional, less visible position within the firm. But Charles refused. He reportedly told aides that Catherine understood the monarchy better than anyone else, and that her input had become indispensable. That word, indispensable, struck a nerve deeper than anyone could have imagined. Camilla, once the king's emotional center, now watched herself being edged out by a woman who had never asked to replace her. But Catherine wasn't the only player in this dangerous game of loyalty. Someone else had begun moving in the shadows, and their intentions were far from noble. All royal betrayals start small: a whispered comment, a misdirected email, a suspicious glance. But this one was different. It was coordinated, deliberate, and devastating. The leak wasn't an accident, it was revenge, and the person behind it had access to Charles's most private moments. For weeks, the tension behind palace walls had become unbearable. Staffers operated under a cloud of mistrust, with allegiances shifting silently from one camp to another. In the midst of this, a quiet yet calculated figure had emerged from the background, a once respected aide from the king's communications team. Recently demoted and increasingly bitter, they had become the ghost in the palace corridors. Their name wasn't mentioned publicly, but within the firm, everyone knew who was being watched. Removed from daily briefings and restricted from high-level meetings, they had vanished from public-facing roles with barely a whisper of explanation. But behind the scenes, this former confidant had a motive, a plan, and most dangerously, access. They weren't just angry, they were methodical. The leaked call, as it turned out, wasn't intercepted or hacked. It was recorded from a palace line, one known only to a few senior staffers. Someone had planted a tap, a deliberate, high-risk breach of protocol that could only have been executed by someone deeply familiar with royal operations. And this wasn't a mistake. The timing, the emotional rawness of the content, the framing, it all pointed to something much darker than disloyalty. This was meant to humiliate. It was meant to destroy. Within days, anonymous sources began feeding the press lines, suggesting the leak was a warning, an attempt to expose duplicity within the palace, as one whispered to a tabloid. Others were more pointed, hinting that the aide had acted not alone, but in service of someone else. All eyes turned toward Camilla's inner circle. The theory? That the aide, loyal to the Queen Consort and alarmed by Catherine's growing proximity to the king, had acted to derail her rise and realign the royal dynamic in Camilla's favor. Whether Camilla sanctioned it or not was never proven, but the damage was already done. The question of motive ignited a fire that would not be extinguished. The palace's response was swift, secretive, and severe. Royal security launched an internal probe so intense that multiple staff members were reportedly placed on temporary leave. Phones were seized. Offices were combed for surveillance. Interviews ran late into the night. And yet, even amid this upheaval, the prime suspect vanished. Within 48 hours of the audio leak going public, the aide left London. No forwarding address, no official statement, no trace. It was as if they'd never existed, but the wound they left behind bled into every corner of the monarchy. Charles, already reeling from fractured trust and internal war, took the betrayal as a personal collapse. The idea that someone so close could exploit his private anguish confirmed his worst fears. That loyalty in the palace was an illusion. That nothing, no relationship, no vow, no structure was safe anymore. As the palace scrambled to control the narrative, Charles withdrew, and it was during this isolation that he reached his emotional breaking point. In the dead of night, the king made a call that was never meant to be heard. But what was captured on tape was more than a conversation, it was a confession. He wasn't just breaking down. He was breaking free. "I can't trust her anymore," he said, and the silence that followed was deafening. Far from the grandeur of Buckingham and the whispers of Windsor, Charles had retreated to Balmoral, a place that once offered peace but now echoed with unrest. Alone in the vast estate, away from advisors, aides, and royal expectations, he reached for the phone with hands that trembled not from age, but from betrayal. Those close to him said his demeanor had shifted since the leak. He had become withdrawn, unpredictable. But what no one expected was for him to vocalize the unspoken fracture tearing through the monarchy's heart. On that call, his voice wavered between agony and fury. He didn't raise it, he didn't need to. The tremor in each word said more than volume ever could. He spoke of betrayal not just within his marriage, but within the very walls of the palace. He described feeling like a prisoner in his own reign, manipulated by those who once pledged their unwavering loyalty. The words "false crown" surfaced, haunting in their meaning. "She knows what she's doing," he said, his voice tight with grief. "And I let her." The weight of that admission broke through decades of royal stoicism. This wasn't the king speaking. This was the man behind the title, exhausted, betrayed, and no longer willing to protect the illusion. But the most damning moment of all came when he whispered something darker, that someone inside the family had played both sides. It was a veiled accusation, but the implication was clear. Trust, already fragile, had been shattered not only by outsiders, but by blood. It was no longer about just Camilla, or Catherine, or even the aide. It was about the entire structure, the institution itself rotating around quiet agendas and carefully masked ambition. His words pierced through years of silence. "I've lost control of the palace," he confessed, broken. "And I don't know who to believe." That single line tore through the monarchy like a storm, because it wasn't just an admission of personal failure, it was the unraveling of the crown's internal foundation. The call, secretly recorded and leaked with surgical precision, didn't just expose the cracks, it forced the world to see the fracture lines long denied by the public face of royalty. For Charles, it was liberation through collapse, a final purge of the truth he could no longer contain, and for those who heard it, it became impossible to unhear. His pain, once kept behind palace walls, now belonged to the world. That single call became the fuse. But the explosion came when Charles confronted Camilla face to face for the first time since the leak. They were supposed to be a united front, but instead, their meeting turned into a war of accusations, broken trust, and shattered illusions. Charles demanded answers. Camilla gave ultimatums. And what followed was a storm that shook even the most hardened staff to their core. It happened behind the heavy doors of Clarence House's private wing, where no press was allowed and only the most senior aides dared to linger outside. What was meant to be a controlled, private confrontation became a verbal battleground, raw, volatile, and irreversible. Charles, still reeling from the leak, came armed with suspicion and rage. His voice was sharp, controlled at first, but beneath the surface it seethed with the sting of betrayal. He confronted Camilla directly, his tone not of a husband, but of a sovereign who had been undermined. The question he asked simple, chilling, hung in the air like a sword. "Was it you?" There was no preamble, no lead-in, just accusation. Camilla didn't flinch, but her response cut just as deep. "You let her in. You shut me out." Those words, laden with years of resentment, cracked the illusion of solidarity that had held their public image together for decades. The woman Charles once defended against an entire nation was now standing against him not just as a wife, but as a rival for influence, for control. She didn't deny the growing power struggle within the palace. She didn't deny the aide's allegiance. Instead, she pointed the finger back at Charles, accusing him of pushing her into a corner, of allowing Catherine to overshadow the queen consort in both purpose and proximity. Their voices rose. According to staff positioned near the hallway, it was no longer a conversation, it was a screaming match. Doors shook. Words like loyalty, humiliation, and consequences pierced through the walls. 4 senior aides reportedly overheard the exchange, frozen outside as 2 of the monarchy's most powerful figures unleashed years of simmering bitterness. At one point, Charles allegedly shouted that he would formally re-evaluate Camilla's titles and public responsibilities, an unprecedented threat that shattered any sense of marital or royal stability. It wasn't just anger, it was a monarch reclaiming control from someone he now saw as a political liability. But this moment wasn't born in isolation. It was the collision of decades of scandal, sacrifice, and unresolved wounds. Their relationship had survived public hatred, family outrage, and moral condemnation. Yet, it was this private fracture of trust and power, that proved more destructive than anything else. Because it wasn't just about love anymore. It was about who would stand beside the crown and who would be left behind by it. But as the royals warred within their walls, the outside world caught wind and the fallout would soon become public. It only took one leak for the media to pounce, and they did, with claws out. Tabloids, networks, insiders, all racing to dissect every breath of the king's breakdown. Was the monarchy collapsing from within, and was this the moment the public finally chose sides? What had once been confined to the hushed halls of Clarence House now became headline fuel. King's call leaked, is Camilla finished, blared across front pages. Talk shows turned speculative, columnists sharpened their pens, and royal watchers devoured every new revelation. The audio wasn't just a scandal, it was a turning point. Overnight, Charles's vulnerability became the nation's obsession, and his words not meant for anyone outside the walls of Balmoral, became symbols of a monarchy under siege. Every second of that call was pulled apart, analysed, and interpreted through the lens of betrayal and power, and the questions swirled like wildfire. Who had failed the king? Who could he trust? And more urgently, who should rule if he no longer could? Public sentiment didn't just shift, it surged. Support for Catherine skyrocketed, painting her as the calm in the chaos, the quiet strategist rising above the noise. In sharp contrast, Camilla's image plummeted. Where once there had been cautious acceptance, now there was outright backlash. Online forums, public polls, even street interviews showed a remarkable swing in opinion. "We never truly trusted her," one poll respondent declared. "Catherine should be the one beside the throne now." The contrast between Camilla's perceived maneuvering and Catherine's steadfast silence became a powerful narrative, one that the press ran with, relentlessly. Royal commentators, never ones to fan flames lightly, began speaking of something unspoken but seismic. A silent power transfer, not formal, not declared, but underway nonetheless. Catherine, once relegated to ceremonial roles and dutiful appearances, was now being referred to in whispers as the true stabilizing force of the monarchy. Palace insiders leaked suggestions that senior royals were seeking her counsel more than ever before. Some speculated she had already assumed certain private duties once carried by the Queen Consort. If that were true, it wasn't just a scandal, it was a quiet revolution. The chaos wasn't confined to the UK. Foreign media framed the crisis as a potential constitutional unravelling. Australian and Canadian networks questioned whether they would continue accepting the crown as their symbolic head. American outlets, long obsessed with the Sussex drama, shifted focus. This wasn't about Harry and Meghan anymore. This was about the core of the monarchy cracking from within. The question loomed like thunder. Was this the moment the system itself gave way? Behind closed doors, murmurs grew louder that Charles had been advised, perhaps even urged, to step back temporarily from public duties. Not as punishment, but for protection. Protection of the institution. Protection of the crown. For the first time since Diana's death, the monarchy's credibility stood on a knife's edge. And with every passing hour, it became harder to control the narrative. The palace's silence was no longer strategic. It was suffocating. Amid the chaos, Charles made a bold and unexpected move, one that no one, not even his closest advisors, saw coming. Weeks after the leak, a sealed envelope surfaced, addressed not to Camilla or William, but to Catherine. Inside was a handwritten note, trembling with regret and clarity. It wasn't just a letter, it was a legacy. A final confession from a king who had lost control and found truth too late. The letter didn't arrive with any ceremony. It was hand-delivered by a trusted royal courier, placed discreetly in Catherine's hands away from the public eye. It was said to be sealed with the king's personal crest, no aides, no intermediaries, just him and her. A private channel carved out amidst public chaos. At first, its existence was denied, buried under the weight of the unfolding scandal. But eventually, palace insiders confirmed what many had suspected. The king had put pen to paper, not to defend himself, but to unburden his soul. In a world ruled by statements crafted by press teams, Charles had chosen ink and vulnerability. And the words inside were damning. "You were right. She's not who I thought she was." That line, leaked to the press days after the letter was delivered, spread like wildfire. The "she" in question, unnamed, left little to the imagination. But it was what followed that shook the foundations of the monarchy. Charles admitted to breaking promises not to the institution, but to Diana. He referenced conversations long hidden from public view, promises of protection, of transparency, of putting his sons first. Promises that, in hindsight, he now confessed had been swallowed by power, pride, and deception. It was, in essence, an apology not just to Catherine, but to the ghost of a woman who had warned him of the cost of compromise. But the most emotional passage, according to sources close to the Princess of Wales, was not about the past but the future. "Protect the children from the mistakes of the past," Charles wrote, in what many believe to be a plea for legacy, not absolution. He wasn't just worried about the crumbling of the monarchy, he feared the corrosion of its soul, the manipulation, the ambition, the silence he had seen it consume him. And now, in his final confession, he was asking Catherine to shield the next generation from the same fate. That request, however, was not shared with Camilla. Insiders claim the letter was immediately locked away by Prince William, shielded from interception. Whatever passed between Charles and Catherine was to remain private, untouchable. The Queen Consort, notably absent from that narrative, had no access to the words that may have changed everything. Whether out of protection, vengeance, or strategy, the decision to keep her from the contents of that letter spoke volumes. Trust had not only been broken, it had been rerouted. The final words of the letter, never meant to be public, eventually surfaced through palace sources. They were simple, powerful, haunting. "If I fall, make sure the crown lands on the right head." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a command. It was a plea from a man who had realized, far too late, that power without principle is a curse, and that only one woman left in the palace had the clarity to guide the throne forward. And just when the dust seemed ready to settle, an unthinkable twist shattered the silence. In a room behind closed palace doors, the highest-ranking members of the royal family gathered, not for ceremony, but for a reckoning. A confidential vote was cast, and the result could alter the future of the monarchy forever. The question on the table: who should hold true power now that the king's trust has collapsed? It was an emergency session convened under a veil of silence, no media briefings, no formal statements, just a call from the Queen's Privy Council that summoned the monarchy's inner circle. This wasn't a formality, it was a crisis response. The events of the past weeks, the leak, the confrontation, the letter, had fractured the public's confidence. But worse, they had fractured the House of Windsor itself. Charles, emotionally drained and politically vulnerable, had been quietly sidelined under the guise of a health and security review. While the public was told the king was resting, inside the palace, power was shifting. Present were the three pillars of the firm's future: Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Prince William, veterans of the royal system, yet all united in one shared goal: preservation of the crown at any cost. The vote was swift, no grand debate, no delay. The monarchy needed clarity, and it needed it immediately. They agreed to a restructuring of duties, a recalibration of control, and at the center of this new structure stood one name: Catherine. Without announcement, without ceremony, she was appointed to oversee key strategic responsibilities, including public communications, international representation, and internal coordination of royal events. It was a bold yet quiet elevation. And most telling of all, it happened without Camilla's knowledge. The Queen Consort, once entrenched beside the king, was not informed until the decision was final, sealed, and enacted. By the time she received word, the structure had shifted beneath her feet. What this meant, in essence, was that the royal family had orchestrated a peaceful, silent coup, one rooted not in malice, but in necessity. They didn't strip Charles of his crown, but they stripped him of operational control. And in doing so, they acknowledged the one truth the public had already accepted, that leadership now required a steadier, more trusted hand. Catherine didn't seize power. She was handed it by those who knew that if the monarchy was to survive the storm, she would have to be the eye within it. This story is far from over, and with every whisper behind palace walls, the monarchy moves closer to a future no one dared to imagine. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.